Hello, everyone. Welcome to Facility Compliance Think Tank presented by Solarian. My name is Lance Wolf, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. And this is the second webinar in our three-part series related to building strategies. Today's subject, changes in future building designs. Solarian is happy to announce that we're now an ASHE continuing education credit provider. And after today's webinar, you'll receive an email with an ASHE certificate for attending. But remember, you must stay on the webinar for the duration to receive your credit. This webinar has two purposes. First, we want to discuss the best practices in the areas of facilities, life safety, emergency preparedness, and other compliance-related topics. And second, this series of webinars was created to help healthcare professionals network together and share ideas. We want to see this network grow. A little background on me. Again, my name is Lance Wolf, and I'm the Director of Life Safety Compliance here at Solarian. I'm a former life safety code surveyor from Joint Commission, and I have 17 years of experience in hospitals at the director and senior director level. During that time, I oversaw engineering, emergency preparedness, safety, biomed, security, and environmental services. Here's a little bit about today's speaker lineup. First, we have Paul Wetzel. He's a project manager for Whiting Turner Contracting Company, and Paul has been a project manager there for almost 8 years. He's worked as an electrical engineer for the Atlantic Design Group and started his career with the Riley Construction Company. He has the ICRA 8-hour awareness training certification and ASHE accredited healthcare construction workshop certification and a lead AP building design and construction certification. Paul graduated from the University of Kansas with a bachelor's degree with an architectural engineering emphasis in construction management. Next, we have Phil Schuman. Phil Schuman is the vice president with Whiting Turner Company, and he's been working at Whiting Turner for 23 years and has been in healthcare construction nearly the entire time. Phil is an ASHE certified healthcare contractor, CHC, and Phil shares his knowledge, keeping his teams informed of industry trends as a Whiting Turner's Northeast healthcare leader. After Phil, we have Jason Piper. Jason Piper is the Administrative Director of Planning, Design, and Construction at Advent Mid-America Region. And Jason graduated with a bachelor's degree from Pittsburgh State University in 2000. He began his career with Capital Electric Construction in 2000, and after 8 years, he became a part of Advent Health System. He began as a facilities operations manager and worked his way up over the next 12 years to Administrative Director of Planning, Design, and Construction at Advent Health Mid-America Region. We appreciate all of our speakers taking their time out of the day to provide us with their knowledge on this topic, and I'm sure it's going to be informative for everyone here. Here's a few housekeeping items. Each panelist is going to have about 15 minutes of utilizing PowerPoint slides. So take screenshots. We want to make sure that you feel free to use this webinar as a reference. And after our speakers are presented, we're going to have about 10 minutes for a live Q&A session. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions. Don't use specifically use the Q&A, don't use the chat button because we won't be able to get to you with the chat button. But if your toolbar disappears, just scroll your mouse over it and it will reappear. And on the last slide of this presentation, we will have FCTT's web address on it so you can utilize the site to help you network in the future. Well, let's go ahead and get started with the webinar. First, we're going to begin with Paul. Paul, are you there?
I am.
Great, Paul. Well, we're glad to have you here. Go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, so as Lance said, I'm Paul Wetzel with Whiting Turner. I work out of our Kansas City office, and I'm going to talk to you guys today about some future building design ideas and hopefully give a little bit of insight on, the effect on your current financial projections. Next slide, please. So the interesting thing kind of with this topic is while most healthcare trends develop over several years, several decades, most of these changes became necessary over the course of a couple months. So my focuses are going to be on redundancies in building systems, flexibility, how to switch to pandemic mode, and some questions that need to be answered first before designing for flexibility and really looking at flexibility beyond COVID. So we also want to address high density areas in your facilities, review HVAC systems, their existing capacities, room pressure relationships, and look at some IT infrastructure and space needs driven by a shift to telehealth, and really a shift across all industries as people start to work remotely more often. Next slide, please. So to first focus on flexibility and resilience, hindsight being 2020, issues in healthcare design are easy to see, right? We just weren't designing for a pandemic. So, similar to the after effects of, the Silmar earthquake in California developing Oshpod, or code changes after Hurricane Andrew, or the tornado in Moore, Oklahoma. I think the biggest lasting change from these past 13 months is going to be, a rise in code minimums that really force people's hands, take out the opt-in to some shade of the flexibility that we've realized that we need. So the flexibility is just really going to be a standard of care that's implemented across the country. And it's going to, that opt-in with the code minimums raising, I think, is what's going to really drive this into existence here. So the flexibility, ideally, we can use for alternative purposes when we're not in that pandemic mode. We've been designing for some flexibility, but we've now been kind of forced to consider how a hospital can accommodate double, triple the patients. Can 2 beds fit in every room? Is the ICU a standard of care, or is it a place? Which rooms can flex up to immediate care or ICU capacity? Can we convert areas like the PACU or surgical prep into overflow ICUs? And we need to explore with that the need for redundancies in all these building systems to ensure that these units are able to meet the vastly increased equipment loads and patient loads. Next slide, please. So, instead of value engineering out everything that makes projects more robust and more resilient, we need to look at systems to truly add value to the project, to really add that flexibility to the project. So we kind of need to rebrand value engineering and make it sure that we're actually adding the value to the project, not just cutting costs for items that are beyond code minimums or, unnecessary to make the building function. So kind of using the ICUs as an example post-COVID, that flexibility probably means more emergency power capacity, more medical gas capacity, larger piping for additional supplies, designing for a much higher oxygen demand. We can't add patients to ICU rooms if we can't have the capacity to run the equipment to keep them alive. So that's something I think that we're going to see in future buildings. And that's really something, when addressed up front, the costs are relatively marginal to upsize that medical gas, rather than to try and do it after the fact and tear up walls in an existing facility. Next slide, please. So next, really kind of looking at the high density areas where people congregate traditionally. And for a long time, we've been trying to open these spaces up, but with the pandemic concerns in mind, I think we're kind of headed back the other way. The old school check-in desk with the sliding pane of glass to separate the patient from, from the staff, may come back in some fashion. Hospitals are already looking at, moving toward triage processes, finding a way to triage patients before they get to the facility, app-based teletriage, multiple entry points, check-in kiosks as people get into the hospital, similar to what you would see at an airport. Hospitals that haven't done so already are probably reviewing the possibility of moving administrative departments off-site. The possibility of smaller or more sectionalized, or even eliminating waiting rooms if we can get there. All are things that we're going to see in the very near future. Next slide. And I won't focus too much here on HVAC systems and pressure relationships, because I don't want to steal Phil's thunder. That topic is coming. But the pandemic has highlighted a need for increased isolation room capacity. People reviewing the possibility of shifting entire isolation floors or a COVID wing, looking at the possibilities of converting unused spaces into isolation rooms, looking at operation rooms where elective or non-urgent procedures were put on hold. So those rooms were sitting empty. But there are code hurdles and obviously cost hurdles with those things that Phil will fill you in on later. Next slide, please. So telemedicine and telehealth is another example of a service that has really accelerated rapidly due to the pandemic. There's been kind of this slow shift to telemedicine in the years leading up to 2020, but telemedicine really boomed throughout this crisis, and people have found ways to perform these routine checkups and triage without face-to-face interaction. And I think this, while all these other topics that I've been talking about have been adding costs, I think this is one that really benefits the facility. Doctors can see more patients in the same amount of time. There's very little requirement for space. The technology is relatively cheap. In most cases, it's probably already paid for. So this is the big benefit to offsetting some of those costs, and maybe finding that space for flexibility. If you can turn some of those outpatient spaces, and the code allows you to turn those into inpatient spaces, or maybe even eliminating some potential expansions in the futures, especially for facilities that are in already very developed areas and don't necessarily have that luxury of additional land. And obviously the goal of all these advancements is to shorten people's stays, or hopefully make them unnecessary for everyone but the sickest patient. I think that's the biggest benefit that we've seen coming out of the pandemic. It's not all, there are some greener pastures here with post-COVID design. Next slide, please. So the $1 million question, or the hopefully not $1 million question, is the impact on your budgets. It's very, very difficult to put a number on this impact of these pandemic and kind of future design ideas, and what they'll cost beyond what we see in construction today. And it kind of pulls me back to the quote I had on the first slide. Basically, all we know is there will be change. So that it's really unclear, and kind of begs the question of, how far do we take it? What do we assume? Right now, that's next to impossible to answer. But reviewing your budget projections, facilities need to focus on these unknowns. Review contingency values, account for changing technologies, for potential significant added infrastructure needs. Figure out a way to put a value on those unknowns by identifying, some of the major cost drivers. On that note, I don't think it's unfair or overstepping to say that in the next 3 or 4 years, we'll see a 15% increase in the cost of a facility, due to escalation alone. So rather than telling you today it's going to add 20% to all of your future budgets, I kind of want to push toward the idea of target value design or integrated project delivery and lean principles in healthcare construction. Next slide, please. So here's a little bit of a snapshot on some escalation that we've seen in 2021, what we anticipate in 2022. And the highlights here are just from the first quarter. So while it's near impossible to forecast the total effect of COVID-related design changes and current industry-wide, volatility on current financial projections, these are some highlights that we've seen. And all of these cost questions are harder to answer today than in a typical market because of this escalation, because of this volatility that we're seeing industry-wide and nationwide. Construction's come a long way since March, April 2020, when we were shutting down distribution centers, pausing projects, and really didn't know what it would take to climb out of the V that the economy was kind of declining into at that point. But the recovery has been extremely fast, and in some situations, really too fast. Many manufacturers have not been able to keep up with high demand. And then, of course, when supply can't keep up with demand, prices and lead times soar. So we're really thinking that we'll see corrections and move back to more typical escalation, more typical inflation toward the start of 2022. Next slide, please. No, so for projects in design, we really need to consider our budgets, for projects with significant steel, significant lumber, copper, sheet metal, and really for steel, copper, and sheet metal, this impacts just about every single healthcare project. So really keeping our head around what those markets are doing is going to be paramount to making sure that those budget projections are accurate. And really the biggest thing I think to benefit everybody is, target value design. It's made its way into healthcare industry across the country, but still really isn't being utilized to its greatest potential, especially in the Midwest here where I'm located. With target value design, the design and construction is steered toward the target cost. So the designers, the contractors have a chance to, continuously and proactively provide input, evaluate the design, evaluate the cost, and those implications for different design options. And so what this does is it allows this cost to be a constraint of the design rather than an output. It's a little counterintuitive if it's something that you've never been involved in and you've kind of been in that, design, bid, build world that the industry has traditionally gone to. So what this method does is it allows for the facility personnel, for designers, for builders, for suppliers, estimators, and everyone else involved with the job to be on board earlier and provide this real-time input on cost implications, and in some cases, push the option for early release of materials to avoid escalation and to get, to really rid that issue of the lead times and get things ordered faster, to save money and save time and really avoid those issues I went through on my last slide. So when we compare it to traditional design, bid, build, this allows the decision makers to really dial in the budgets, dial in the project, and maximize the value of those dollars. When a 10% cost overrun could easily be a multi-million-dollar issue, this impact's huge. Well, on the flip side of the coin, if there's project savings, you want to be able to realize those savings now, realize those savings before the project kicks off, be able to move that money to a different bucket, use it to add program to the current project, use it to add more of that flexibility that we all need in our facilities right now. Next slide.
Well, thank you, Paul. That was great information. And you had many valid points that I know everybody's asking out there, including myself, on increases. And so, yeah, it really is going to be beneficial, for what you presented today for us going forwards.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Great. Well, next we're going to go ahead and we're going to bring on Phil Schuman, and Phil's going to talk to us about converting patient rooms to handle surges. So, Phil, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Lance, for having me here today.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Phil. Take it away. It's all yours.
Sounds great. So as mentioned earlier, I am a vice president with Whiting Turner. I work up in some of our Connecticut offices, but I help everyone up here in the Northeast when it comes to healthcare to make sure that the planning and the teams are set up for success and deliver quality projects. Slide, please. So COVID has been a huge challenge to our healthcare system, to say the least. In addition to challenging our medical professionals, the researchers in the S&T fields, and ultimately the patients, it's created a very large challenge on our facility departments. With budgets stretched, facility departments have gone to extraordinary efforts to create additional negative space, drive-through testing locations, and many other requests that were needed to provide safe environments of care. I'll be discussing two specific things today that should be considered as we prepare our facilities to handle future outbreaks. First, how does the code and FGI guideline impact the need for additional negative patient rooms? And second, what are some thoughts internally that Whiting Turner has been having about the cost to create these spaces? Slide, please. As everyone is aware, the control of airflow is critical to protecting staff and patients in a hospital environment. Protective environment rooms keep potential infections away from at-risk individuals, such as burn, cancer, or AIDS patients, while airborne infection isolation rooms, AII, isolate a contagious individual and protects our medical staff, as well as the rest of the patient population in the hospital. Slide. Design, construction, and use of AII rooms have many requirements. Some are handled by simple standard operating procedures, such as wear a mask when you enter a room. But some have a larger impact on the use of energy in a hospital, specifically negative air rooms where the contaminated air must be vented fully outside, effectively making air changes a once through without the benefit of recovering heating and cooling that we've already put money into once. Slide. Architecturally, we face requirements that require every patient room have its own bathroom. The recommendation of having an anteroom for every AII room, and converting double occupancy patient rooms to single occupancy. While newer hospitals are usually designed with the single patient model in mind, and many have bathrooms, older facilities face challenges to add these items while maintaining the required square footage for a patient room and also not encroaching on the corridors. Slide, please. Mechanically, the design of negative space is not overly challenging in itself. There does come a challenge when we analyze the upgrading of the existing infrastructure. You need to take into consideration the CFM capacity of your existing air handlers, the chilled water system. So since you're not recovering that cooling or that heating because it's a once through, you're going to have additional cooling needed. And even the electrical equipment services need to be looked at and addressed. In addition to the capital for upgrading this infrastructure, facilities need to consider operating budgets, as with increased energy consumption comes increased cost. Simply converting rooms to negative when the need requires during a surge and then reverting back may not be acceptable to the HJs. Nationally, there has been some guidelines that allowed for some of this during this pandemic. However, if you look specific in the FGI guidelines, it states that the pressure relationship of all AII rooms shall not be changed when not in use. Like many other things within the guidelines, this is to reduce the opportunity for mistake. It's the same reason why we put hand wash sinks on the same wall, so that when nurses come in, it becomes an automatic routine. Medical professionals have been trained on which rooms are for different types of patients. And if these rooms are now going to be converted at the need of the patient, additional training will need to occur. Otherwise, it could lead to deadly mistakes. Slide, please. As noted, AII rooms do not mandate the use of an anteroom. You see two examples right here. On the right, we have the anteroom, and then on the left is a converted room that does not have an existing anteroom. It is still best practice to utilize an anteroom when square footage allows. Another best practice to be considered is the airflow within the room. We know the room itself has to be negative to the corridor, but you also want the airflow to go from the corridor or the foot of the bed where the medical practitioners are going to be standing towards the patient and have the exhaust ideally over the patient. In this example on the left, it's coming in on the corner, goes across the bed and over towards the diffuser in the far corner. You really want that over the patient bed, because any chance for droplets that are coming out of a contaminated person's mouth, you want to minimize that any currents in the air could have those droplets go by the medical practitioners. Additionally, when you do not have an anteroom, you want to be cognizant that every time you open and shut that door, you're going to create some eddies, and some of the air inside the room will go out towards the corridor. So it's important to keep in mind the airflow within the room itself. Slide, please. So after looking at the codes and our understanding of AII rooms, what does that tell us? First, converting rooms is not a simple matter of rebalancing. In addition to meeting the architectural requirements, a larger impact to the facility's infrastructure should be reviewed. Especially as the number of rooms is increased, the demand on our existing systems is going to increase. Second, temporary AII rooms are not really addressed on the guidelines. If there are going to be some requirements that are adjusted, and any adjustment that comes out will have to go hand in hand with education of our healthcare providers to distinguish what mode the room is in, you need to look at the utility operating expenses. Slide, please. So what should these codes address? Other things to look at is ED rooms. So currently, ED exam rooms are not required to be negative. Many emergency departments do have isolation rooms, but with the volume of patients that we've seen during COVID, and the emergency departments being the front line where these patients are coming into on a daily basis, it should be considered do an additional number of rooms, if not all the rooms, have some level of negative air circulation. Allowing convertible surge suites is another option. This could be achieved through some control dampers diverting air from a recirculation mode to 100% exhaust mode. You'd have VFDs on your air handlers and on your exhaust systems that would adjust accordingly to maintain appropriate balance. Currently, there is a panel of professionals, architects, engineers, ASHI professionals that are reviewing these as well as many other potential options. Once these changes are implemented into the guidelines, facilities will need to work with their architects, engineers, and contractors to analyze their specific facilities, implement the renovations, and train their medical professionals before the next outbreak. Slide, please. So let's talk about cost. What does it take to actually convert these rooms? So I've taken a couple typical patient rooms that could be found in any hospital. And for the purpose of this analysis, I've assumed that there is a patient bathroom, and that's where the exhaust is. Other things that you'd find within these typical patient rooms, a lot of times you have a very minimal air change. You know, I think the requirement's around 100 CFM makeup air into the unit, and then you have the bathroom that's exhausting. So you may have anywhere between 2 to 12 air changes per hour. Usually it's a single entrance. You have a lot of rooms with acoustical ceilings. Some older units have VCT, and much older units, you also have to be cognizant of the potential of ACM material within that VCT. Some of the newer ones, you'll have seamless, which is a good sign that's where you want to head towards. Slide, please. So what do we have to do in order to modify these rooms? Well, we need to increase the air changes per hour to a minimum of 12. We have to seal off. Some rooms have potential, they have PPE pass-throughs. A lot of times I've done a lot of hospitals where we build in this millwork PPE, it has doors on both sides. It allows it to be restocked without entering and disturbing the patient. So if you have that, you're going to need to seal that off. Your bathroom, you need to take a look at specifically how it relates to any anteroom if you're going to be able to fit that in. But that bathroom door may need to be relocated if it doesn't work well with where the anteroom would be. If you are going to look at putting an anteroom in, you have to maintain 120 square feet within the patient room itself in order to meet the guidelines requirements. You want to pull up any existing floor that's not in compliant. You want to install some seamless flooring. You're going to increase that exhaust. For our purpose, we recognize that many exhaust in bathrooms, especially in older facilities, are dedicated exhausts. They go direct to the roof, or they gang up and go direct to the roof, depending on how that infrastructure is. You might have to make some modifications, but you could tie into that ductwork, bring some ductwork in a diffuser above that patient bed so that you can then look at your infrastructure, increase that exhaust system as needed. Slide, please. So with the understanding that commodity costs, as Paul was mentioning, are fluctuating greatly due to supply and demand, and that regionally costs could vary, taking a holistic construction approach and looking and saying, okay, I'm going to add a drywall partition. That's going to be where my anteroom's built out of, and that's going to go to the deck. I'm going to replace my flooring. I'm going to paint at a minimum the new drywall partition I made, if not the whole room. But you also probably want to paint the walls that new partition tie into so that it looks very nice. I'm going to need to do ceiling adjustments, both because I'm adding that anteroom and I'm going to have to change some mains, but potentially I'm doing some duct work. I'm going to potentially have to relocate some lights for that duct work. So any ceiling adjustments that you have to do. You're going to be purchasing a new door frame and hardware. That existing door that goes to the corridor is going to have to be upgraded. You're going to have to modify that. You're going to have to put on gaskets around the entire frame. You're going to want to put a nice gasketed sweep on it so that you can help maintain that pressure relationship that you're going to need. You're going to be adding the ductwork, adding the pressure isolation monitor that's out in the corridor so that anyone prior to entering can verify that it's still negative. And then you're going to have to do some balancing as well. So taking all of that into consideration and the variables of where it may fall within the nation, we're estimating around $25,000 to $35,000 if you were to do a single room. Now, obviously, if you're doing multiple rooms or if you're doing an entire suite at the same time, you can get some economy of scales where you're going to be able to bring that number down. Slide, please. So during the pandemic, some of our clients have also done some other items. We've seen negative air entire floors. So there's one hospital that we did the topmost floor when we did the original building was left shelled. So we went in there in 90 days, fit out the entire project, but we also, because we were up at the roof level pretty much, were able to make it so that through dampers, while the rooms were always negative, it could be converted from 100% outside air to recirculating. You can put controls in place and do a mechanical solution that will rebalance those rooms if you already have the infrastructure in place to make sure that you're running negative. Another item that we've seen in some older hospitals where the ceiling space and the patient room itself location within the facility didn't allow for direct exhaust and increase, adding some HEPA filters that were recirculating units. While this doesn't comply with the making the room negative, it certainly added to some safety for the medical professionals as that air was increased the number of filtrations that it received every hour. Slide, please. So what should you take away from this study? The guidelines need to be adjusted to deal with pandemics. I encourage everyone on this call today to talk with their architects, their engineers, ASHE professionals, anyone that you may know that is on that FGI committee, to let your voices be heard. Let them know what you feel can be achievable within different types of facilities. Consult with your code experts if you're considering a project. And even more importantly, the authorities having jurisdictions. You should be talking with your state health inspectors to discuss the potential gap that currently exists in the guidelines and make sure that whatever you are planning is going to be implementable and acceptable. And then finally, don't look through a narrow lens at any one renovation. You can't look at it as just one room. You need to look at your infrastructure because there are potential impacts both on the heating, cooling side. You know, Paul was mentioning the O2 lines. There was one of our clients, they were bringing in supplemental tankers for O2, but because all of that oxygen was going through one point, it was freezing up the line, and they had to constantly be out there spraying the line with warmer water to cool it down. So speak to those engineers, look at what it's going to do both from an infrastructure needs and what your utility operational budget's going to be. One thing that I do know is all the healthcare professionals I've ever worked with, they're built to overcome these challenges. We'll continue to work to ensure safe environments of care for the patients, for the healthcare workers, for the facility workers, and for the contractors that come into the space. So I thank you for your time today. And next slide.
Great, thank you, Phil. That was also, you had excellent points there, and that information really is something that is going to be passed on, for the future. We really appreciate your time today.
Certainly, it was my pleasure.
Yeah. All right. Well, next we're going to move on to Jason Piper now, and we're going to talk about current and upcoming plans for building design changes. So, Jason, are you there?
That I am.
Okay, Jason. Well, take it away. Thank you.
All right, Lance, appreciate it. Thanks for having me here. I just kind of wanted to pause for a minute and say congratulations to everybody that's on this. Thanks for participating. Thanks for staying safe. And if you ended up having to deal with the pandemic, congratulations on making it through. And my thoughts and prayers go out to the ones out there that lost somebody to this awful pandemic. So we have to start every meeting off like that to talk about what we've been through and where we're going. So also, Jill, as she knows, and the other people on the panel that I've done this with before, I kind of follow the slides somewhat, but what I really want to spend some time on real quick before we get into my stuff is, guys, you should print off Paul's slides and print off Phil's slides, because I wish I could collaborate with them when we were going through those slides, because I was going to say exactly yes, and I could give you a story. So just on Paul's piece that he was talking about with material escalation, I'm going through that right now. And so just give you a couple examples of what I'm dealing with right now. So doing a small addition, and it's wood frame. We priced this out, say 6 months ago, and my bill of material was $45,000 for the wood frame that we need. Just got informed that they went to release the material. Now that is going to cost around $70,000 to do that work. So we are seeing that. He talked about copper. Copper's one piece, but the other piece, once they get the copper figured out, it's going to be the PVC insulation that goes on that copper wire that we're seeing. And it's just these small effects. I was in a equipment design. We want to do a new cath lab here at the hospital. And as everybody knows in the industry, usually that's 12 weeks. Sitting there talking to the gentleman, he said, well, if you cut me a PO today, that is a 26-week lead time. So when you're trying to get speed to market and you're trying to get all this here in that 26 weeks and trying to get the funding for that piece is absolutely, that's unheard of. That affects the performa, that affects the capital outlay and how we want to deliver healthcare. So, and when I go into my slides, guys, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the inpatient side, but more on the outpatient, what we figured out, because right now, just got to be honest with you, I'm trying to figure out what we're doing on the inpatient side. I have 2 large projects that I'm in the process of designing currently. One is the remodel at the main hospital, to where I'm remodeling our existing rooms. So Phil's diagram that he has is, that's going to be my gospel moving through to kind of hold accountability. And the other piece to that is I'm also going through design for a new campus out of our Lenexa tower, is what we're going to be doing out in Lenexa City Center. And to that, we already have an established budget. We were given a budget approval halfway through pandemic last year. So we paused, waited, and now we want to pick back up. But the problem is I have so much of a budget, but that really didn't have any pandemic response that we never knew that we'd have to do until we're doing now, and trying to get that figured out. So it's going to be interesting to see what the next year brings for us. I'm going to kind of take that, and I'm kind of interested myself to see how that plans out. So hang with me here. So I'll kind of go into my slides. So with that, Jill, next slide, please. So our challenges that we ran into is we first stood up incident command at the main hospital January 28th of 2020. And what that was simply for was we had some doctors that were on a mission trip, and we wanted to talk about how we're going to bring those people back safely. And we really, to be honest, wasn't taking the pandemic all that serious because we didn't know a whole lot about it. So that was on the 28th of January. By mid-February, we have stopped having people come to the hospital. By the 1st of March, we stopped elective surgeries. And then in that process, we had to come up with a PPE solution, notice in PPE solution. So it was quite something to figure out to where the construction integrates into that. You know, we got the construction team. I was working with the facilities team there at the hospital, and we created our own built up our own decontam for all our PPE, so we didn't have to consume so much. And then, man, we were writing POs. I mean, we wrote a PO, $500,000 for masks. And then we wrote another PO that I can't even tell you how much that was, but when you see 6 semi trucks show up, and on that semi truck is nothing but hand sanitizer, and then you're trying to figure out what am I building to house this stuff in? So with what all we dealt with to get there. So the challenge that we had for planning for spaces was social distancing and COVID protocols. So what that ended up affecting is our main entrances, pre-surgery clinics that we have people come in and get tested for pre-surgery before we stopped doing elective surgeries, middle part of March. And then what we're dealing with is trying to keep that in mind. So they go into the pre-surgery, and then after they do the surgery, they're in the PACU. Well, PACU bays, as everybody knows, those are stacked right up next to each other, and those just have a simple curtain in between them. And then you're figuring out what is your safety protocol from going patient to patient to patient. So with construction wise, we're able to create some stark walls and kind of do some isolation on that piece. Surgery waiting rooms, that was a large one. So coming into surgery waiting rooms, one of the first things we did is we went through and just started marking off chairs saying people got to spread out. Well, people really only want to follow the rules that they want to follow. So then it comes down to, well, we have to pull the chairs out. And then where do those chairs go? Another challenge that we had is our cafeteria. Our cafeteria where all of our staff, during the day, when we're fully staffed, we have 2,400 employees. Where are those 2,400 employees when they go down to eat? Where are they going? How are they getting through the line? So building up containment to get people around. You know, they kind of look to the construction facilities team signage kind of method process to kind of get through that. And then the last piece was our break rooms. You know, they come down, they can't eat in the cafeteria. Where can they go? They can't go to their break rooms because then you gotta create the social distancing aspect to that piece as well. So those were our challenges. So when next slide, please. So on the solutions for this. So I'm just letting you know, I'm not having a whole lot of slides because some of the slides, you know, compliance wise, we really don't want to put out there that, hey, we kind of skirting the line with the AHJ, but I can talk about it as far as what we went, but really didn't take any much pictures on it. So just if you see that picture right there, that's on the slide with infectious control piece, given everything's there, but that's really not social distance because we do allow that chair should actually be out of there. That's where it really came down to as far as the really social distancing piece of what you come up with. So once we did start allowing patients, visitors back into the hospital, we picked up our elective surgeries, which created a more census into the hospital. So what it all comes down to is, as everybody knows, you had to come in, get your temperature taken first thing, and then you had to hand sanitize. Well, in order to get that, you have to do crowd management to get everybody to go through it. Well, that is at your main entrance, which is, of course, one of your main egress paths. So how do you get around that? So the building of containment, but also with the containment that's built, what do you end up taking away? So a lot of it just came down to markings on the floor. So we just kind of, hey, follow the markings on the floor. And then it comes down to the ICRA process on the people that were at check-in and check-out and people that were at the main entrance monitoring that. When we did have an event, say a fire alarm, emergency response, what was everybody's response to that piece? How did they go to it? So waiting room sizes, what you end up seeing in our waiting rooms, which we'll go to when I go to my next slide, you'll see we've reduced our, to Paul's point previously, waiting room sizes, we've reduced roughly by 45% moving forward in our outpatient modalities. Really haven't approached that on inpatient yet, so we're just trying to see how we can end up getting it. Furniture spacing. What it comes down with furniture is we just went through and bought all brand new furniture and everything was filled up. Well, now you got to space everything out. Where's that stuff going? So when we go on to the next slide, I'll kind of show that it shows outfitted what we would fill the waiting room up with. But then it also goes with, I'm only putting half the furniture that's shown on the plan. Pre-registration, that goes to the point where Paul brought up earlier, the telehealth piece, the pre-registration. So usually what happens is you came into the hospital and you sat down at a desk and you got checked in and you did everything that way. Now you're sent a app 2 days before your surgery to where you're able to do all your pre-registration. You're able to get check-in on all your labs. Or if you need labs done, you're able to do that to where it's just-in-time care, to where you stay in your car, you got a text, you come in, you go right into the room, you get your blood drawn, you do your checkout there, and then you move on out. And then the family member clustering. That was a tough one for us because we have a large birth center there at Shawnee Mission Health. We average over 5,000 births a month. So when you do the math, that's quite a few births. And then you have to have the family members, grandma, grandpa, mom and dad, everybody that wants to be around. So then we had to limit that down to one person. But then we provided little viewing areas to where people could go to the window and had a little safe place for people to stand to be able to wave up to the tower to the individuals that were in there. So those were kind of the solutions that we're looking into. But if we go on to the next slide. So with the future responses, so we got the telehealth, which I brought up earlier, exam room count. So when I go to this next slide, that's the drawing I keep referencing. When we go to the next slide, the exam room counts. So looking at this, I usually had my calculation would be 2.5 rooms per provider is when I did my design, is what I do. And when you figure that out, that'd roughly be around 1,300 to 1,400 square feet per provider is what they need. So it's just simple calculations. So when I sat down with somebody, how many providers we need, they tell me this. Well, that has now changed. So it changed not with the square footage requirement. I'm still averaging around 1,200 to 1,300 square feet, but my support space has gotten smaller. What I've increased is my healthcare space to where the patient room itself, to what I can do in it, and the number of rooms is what I've done. And this is just a response on, hey, man, we are cutting down on our waiting room areas. Our lab area doesn't have to be as bad because I'd have a sub-waiting that would have room for about 10 people in our labs. So when you see this next piece, I've got it down to where there's just 2, to where we're kind of we're focusing on the just-in-time healthcare. So nobody's sitting around waiting anymore, which is a customer satisfier. Nobody really wants to be in the doctor's office longer than what they have to. Nobody wants to be in the hospital longer than they have to. So they just want to come in, and what we say, we want to treat them and street them. That's kind of a slang term, but that's what the customer wants. He wants to come in, good health care, and get on about their day. So in the change in the triage area, as far as bring them in, we've got the triage. Most of it's done. We even have it to when they first check in, while they're walking back to the patient room, they put the little clip on their finger. We take all their vitals on the way to the room. By the time they're sitting in the room, their triage is basically done. Checkout process, we do the check-in and basically checkout in the room. So we're not doing the checkout areas that you see where everybody clusters up by the door to where I got to check out and everybody's standing around. We've kind of got away from that as well. So with that all being said, let's just, next slide, please. All right, guys. So I'm going to talk about what we've done in our outpatient modality. And I've just now started this project to where just last night, I made a modification to this due to COVID and due to lab response, which I spoke about earlier. But first, if you notice, the plan I'm talking about is plan of the gray box. So if you come in, you'll follow down that main corridor and you'll see that the main entrance coming into the space. Okay, see those waiting room chairs there to where we have 2, 4, 6, 8 chairs. When I do that, there'll only be 4 chairs in that alcove, but we've master planned it to be able to have 8. So we picked up a lot of flow in that area when they come in off main check-in. Usually I have a large large check-in desk. We've reduced that down to 2, and we've isolated that also with PVC, basically decorative glass, to kind of get some isolation going. The change that you see, guys, if you see the lab area, and once again, I didn't want to complicate the slide because I just changed this last night. That lab area is no longer there. I took that lab and moved it over to plan left, right in the corner to where it's exam room up in the very corner off the corridor. I took that and turned that into a lab and gave that an exterior door. So basically everybody coming into labs, instead of them coming into the suite, they can come in and get out and not have to intermingle with the healthcare that we have going on. And I didn't lose any patient rooms with that layout. So kind of want to talk with these. You'll notice that we're right sized from my usual models as far as rooms, but I basically have, if I was to do this in the number of providers, this space would have 8 less rooms in it. But because we're doing so much modality out of common area and putting it in the healthcare aspect of it and in the room, the check-in, the check-out, the triage, all that piece is all done in route and doesn't have any common area sitting spaces. I was able to maximize the healthcare space and turn those into treatment rooms, which administration likes that. More patient rooms, more treatment, more return on investment. But when it comes down to, guys, I can't speak to it. I don't know what my fear is right now, just be honest with you, the time that the patient spends in the room. Are they going to be in there a lot waiting for this? If we're getting to a full clinic, there's only so many people that's going to be coming in doing check in, check out. So I can kind of check back on that and kind of fill you guys in how that goes after we get this clinic open. Speed to market on this one. Just gave the notice to proceed at the 1st of the month, and we need to have this turned over at the end of July. So we're looking at roughly around 120 days duration, which is rather quick. And then to Paul's point, what I was talking about earlier, we're facing some shortages, having a little problem with our wood doors lead times, having a problem with our metal studs at the same time. So also I'd like to reference him back to Paul's slides, is what he was talking about, the telehealth piece. If you guys notice down in the bottom right and left-hand corner of this plan, those are our telehealth kiosks that we have. Just got a simple slider door on it. Doctor walks in, able to do their telehealth appointments that they have. They're soundproof. So as far as the HEPA compliance on each of those pieces, that is something brand new that we've just started, and it's a huge satisfier. I was able to do that in a previous clinic, and they were able to see their patient flow is more in those telehealth rooms than it is in the actual patient rooms themselves. So excited on that aspect. They also use those to where before I had to give each doctor their own basically provider offices. Well, this also meets as their office, but also able to do telehealth, and it's shared because we can go into a timeshare aspect, and it's shared amongst multiple doctors. So guys, I know I kind of ran through this real quick, but this is just, I kind of want to reference back on Paul and Phil's slides, because what they gave you guys was great information. It's a lot of this stuff that I'm just now being faced, that I'm living through. So guys, what they're talking about is a reality. It really is. So I encourage you, print those slides off, learn them, and be able to go to your client and speak the knowledge that you learned here today, because guys, it's the truth. So with that said, next slide, and that should be it for me.
Great, Jason. Thank you very much. I mean, those are excellent examples for real life of what you're doing, and it really solidifies this webinar to this point. So now we're going to switch to, we're also going to talk about changes in future building designs, but we're going to talk about a surveyor's perspective. Next slide, please. So what are the possible changes that will be made? And keep in mind, a lot of this that we're going to be talking about now from this point, from with the surveyor's perspective, has already been talked about. So this is just kind of confirming what the compliance aspect is focusing on as well. So one is obviously the pressure relationships changing due to a pandemic response. That's been a focal point. That's still going to be a focal point on how we're going to approach that from this point on. Also, ER designs will become more of a focus as well. And the main thing with ER designs is they're focusing on how quickly can you turn an ER a larger ER into two separate ERs with two different pressure relationships and make them completely segregated from each other. Also, entrances are going to be redesigned to limit access quickly. That was been a big item that's been talked about throughout facilities. They talked about that they had a hard time limiting that access, even though they'd already planned on it, for future, for as part of their planning. They realized that they really did have a lot of egress issues. They had a lot of ingress issues. So those are going to be areas that are going to be focused on as well. And next, the building, as I talked about earlier, is going to be designed. Not only is it going to be the ER, the building itself is going to actually expand and designed to become two separate buildings and work independent of each other. And both Phil, Paul, and Jason have all talked about this as well. Next slide, please. So again, what are the accrediting agencies saying? Well, currently, right now, the accrediting agencies still are surveying to the FGI pressure relationship guidelines. So if you've got a survey coming up, that's what they're going to be surveying to. And your pressures are going to be surveyed based upon the patient that's housed in the room or based upon what the area was designed for. And a perfect example is a bronch room, an isolation room. And you're going to have a discussion. It's going to involve any changes you made to the area during COVID-19. And as Jason talked about, with this pandemic, there were times where certain facilities were forced to make changes to be able to take on patients for COVID-19. So you're going to want to make sure that you really focus on a discussion on what changes you did and what you did to make sure that you maximize patient safety during that time. Next slide, please. So here's the big question. What if I changed my pressures during COVID? Well, if you did change your pressures due to increasing COVID patients, you're going to need to follow your internal policy on testing. If you changed it, you needed to have a policy in place on how you were making sure that you were following up to make sure that those pressures were staying consistent. Then also, if your pressures are changed back to the original design, you're going to want to show that it was tested and verified prior to patient placement. You want to show that you're closing that loop. And that goes with anything with your testing. If you have a failure in anywhere, and this is kind of that same concept, is you want to make sure it was tested and verified prior to putting any patients in the area or putting it back into use. Also, you want to ensure that you bring the original design back to FGI guidelines. That's going to be the focus, that's the accrediting agencies are going to keep continually talk about. Then also your surveyor is going to speak to you about error changes and ensure that the testing was verified per FGI guidelines. So if you say, well, we went back to FGI guidelines, they're going to follow up and make sure that the FGI guidelines are met, and they're going to want to see those error changes and pressure relationships. Next slide, please. So yeah, another question is, did I need to do a risk assessment? Yes, when changing the pressures to meet the needs of the patient, a risk assessment should have been completed and reassessed during this time. If you haven't and you're in this situation right now and you're coming up on your window, do a risk assessment immediately, okay? And then when doing changes in the future to meet those needs, ensure you do that risk assessment and make sure it's multifaceted. So you want to make sure you have clinical, infection control, safety, engineering. You want to have everybody on board when you do that risk assessment to make sure that you're closing the loop in all those areas. Next slide, please. So what do we do from this point? Well, you're going to work closely with the architects on future building designs. It's going to be a focus, obviously, with future designs, as Jason alluded to, and it's going to that unfortunately for engineering and for construction is not going to go away anytime soon. So ensure you focus more on the environmental factors than you do on your value engineering. Make sure you don't get into a situation where you're actually taking the building, what the building is designed for, taking it away due to value engineering, because then also obviously you're back in the same situation that many facilities were in before COVID-19. Also, prepare your administration for building price increases. Let them know that this is going to happen, and give them an idea on what type of increases it's going to be, so they don't get a shock on the amount of with materials and how much everything's increased. And also, you're going to utilize the upcoming changes with emergency preparedness. So you're going to work closely with emergency preparedness to justify your design needs. Use them to your advantage as well. So as Jason talked about, as Paul talked about, and as Phil talked about, is we're all kind of in that infantile stages right now on what's going to happen forwards, but we're already seeing some changes. One of the things that Jason talked about, and I can also definitely let him know that's happening, is, for example, the state of California recently passed a law stating in regards to PPE that certain facilities based upon your size have to have 3 months now of PAR levels on site. So no longer are we talking a room, we're talking warehouses now to be able to store stuff. So keep in mind, we're in infantile stages, and we'll try to keep you updated, as everything keeps happening in the future, and work amongst each other. Next slide. Well, that's all I have for me. Now we're going to move to the question and answer session of this, and we're going to give you a few minutes to see, since we've covered a lot of information, we're going to give you a few minutes to be able to enter any other questions that you may have, but we already have some questions in the queue. So first one here is, the first one is for Phil. And the question is, Phil, is with the changes in future building designs, what do you feel is most important area to focus on immediately in regarding to pre-planning?
I think right off the top, we can all look at our infrastructures, especially some of the older hospitals. They're already pushing their infrastructures to the limit. And if you know that you're going to have an increase in CFM required, and if you're going to be exhausting more, you need to look at your chilled water systems. You need to look at your air handlers. You can probably be reaching out to MEP professionals and get a good handle on what that's going to be, so that once you do see the new guidelines issued, you already have in place a plan, or at least the knowledge of what's going to need to be upgraded in the future.
Okay, great. Okay, the next question we have is, it's for Paul. I think this is, Paul, I think this would be the best one for you, is what's the biggest roadblock you're coming across with transitioning from current projects to meeting future designs?
I mean, I guess it's got to be the cost and market volatility aspect. Any sort of delay or redesign, it just takes time, and there are some big question marks on really what the full impact is going to be of those construction costs over the coming months and year. I think 11 or 12 months ago, when I was actively working in an active facility, I think the big question probably was, how do we keep these people busy? And if this project stalls, how are we going to keep our labor on site? But today it has to be that volatility.
Okay, yeah, I agree. I think that's kind of the general theme, and that's we've heard during this webinar as well. So next question, I can take this one, is our accrediting agencies going to survey the future building designs immediately? And I covered that a little bit in my section. No, they're going to still focus on the FGI guidelines. So you're going to want to follow your accrediting agency and wait for them to come out until they start identifying future designs that they're going to start surveying to. But they all will stick with the current FGI guidelines, and you don't have to worry about them starting to transition off that. If your surveyor is doing that, I would contact your accrediting agency, because that's your surveyor that's actually interpreting something. Okay, and then looks like we got another. Jason, this would be one for you. So the question is how is your administration responded to changes in building designs? And are they positive, or are they negative to the changes that are coming up?
I'll have to say the changes that came up, nobody likes that price tag that's coming to it. So, we're looking at anywhere from 20 to 35% on stuff that we were looking at 8 months ago. So as far as, yeah, they don't like it, but they understand what it needs to happen. It just creates a lot of conversation to where we have to get the nursing administration, infectious control, quality involved to see, all right, what do we do to prepare ourselves better next time, seeing how we're spending these dollars and making the dollars work for us with the overages that we're facing with pre-approved budgets. So they understand it has to happen. This is new to everybody. So it's just as long as nobody's running off buckshot making decisions, we're being methodical about it and discussing it. So definitely getting their buy-in and explaining to them where we're going along the path is helpful.
Good. Okay, great. Well, I mean, that's good to hear that you're getting the support that you need out there. You know, because it's as this webinar is showing, it's definitely going to be needed. So, okay, well, it looks like we're good for questions. If anybody else has anything, and it doesn't look like we've got any more. So, okay, well then we're going to go ahead and conclude that. We've covered a lot of information, and this is going to be the end of today's topic. I want to thank Paul, Phil, and Jason for your time. And again, this was all great information presented, and we all can benefit from. And Jason, you alluded to it, and so we are very appreciative of everybody's time today. Couple reminders is, one is tomorrow you're going to receive an email with a link to the webinar to review in the future. And we want to encourage you to share this information with your colleagues and get them involved in future webinars. Like we said earlier, we want to see our network grow. So the next registration, next webinar, registration is already open for our May 6th webinar. So go to Solaren.com/think tank to register. And in closing, we want to encourage you to use also Facility Compliance Think Tank Q&A in the group on LinkedIn to get any additional questions answered by your industry experts. We want to remind everybody that this is an area to interact with other professionals in the field, and our panel experts, including the ones today, are going to be included with this group as well. We want to, keep in mind that the members consist of directors and facility compliance leaders for all over the country. So if you have a geographical, location issue, we'll be able to find somebody within the FCTT group that'll be able to help you. Well, that concludes today's webinar. Whiting Tuner, Solaren, and our speakers want to thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.